This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 489, featuring Annie Duke, bestselling author, speaker, decision strategist, and former professional poker player. Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vassilopoulos, founder of Rocky Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey everybody, Jan Rutherford here, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us a part of your day as we study leaders. And as Jim said, episode 489, that means 488 episodes plus 12 masterminds in our catalog at theleadershippodcast.com.
Yes, and this episode is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Darley. They're trusted by warfighters and firefighters since 1908. Darley's dedicated to equipping our military and first responders with the essential tools they need for mission success, from fuel and firefighting pumps to drones and tactical solutions. Discover more about this incredible company and the people who serve our nation's heroes at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And today our special guest is Annie Duke, a 3-time best-selling author, speaker, decision strategist, and visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a PhD in cognitive psychology and, as Jim said, is a former professional poker player. And she's currently the co-founder of the Alliance for Decision Education. Annie, welcome to our show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we always ask, what's not in the public bio?
What's not in the public bio? Let's see. I'm an avid tennis player. That is not in my public bio.
All right.
I take it as seriously as I take almost everything else. So
Is that right? Oh, so you're competitive.
well, I mean, what do you mean by, competitive meaning like I like to improve and win? Yes,
Yes.
for sure.
You were thinking I meant competitive like you're winning all your matches.
I'm trying to, but
There you go.
I don't succeed, sadly. No, but I take it very seriously and I work very hard at it.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
The other thing that's not in my bio is like my family and my dog.
Mm,
My cat,
yeah. What kind of dog?
Bernadoodle.
A Bernadoodle. All right. In Colorado here, if you move here, you have to own a dog. It's like the state law.
Well, duh. Doesn't everybody have to own a dog, just period?
Yeah. Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
That is true. Well, hey, as we said before Jim hit the record button, Jim and I have been really looking forward to this because it's such an important topic, decision making and quitting. And in your book, Quit, The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away, you argue that quitting should be a source of pride.
Mhm.
And so my question is, what makes quitting so central to success? And why do we need to rehabilitate the term quit?
Yeah. So I think it really comes down to this. When you make decisions to start things, you are making those decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So there's two forms of uncertainty. The first is you know very little in comparison to all there is to be known. So let's call that the I'm not omniscient problem. And I'm sure that both of you, Jim and Jan, have had this feeling after the fact where you've said, oh, I wish I knew then what I know now.
Mhm.
And that's actually that sort of coming to the fore, this realization that like when you make the decisions, you don't know everything and that you're kind of going to learn new things afterwards. And some of those things that you learn are going to be things that say, oh, I kind of wish I had known that then. That might have changed the way that I was thinking about the problem. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is, even if you were omniscient, even if you could make a perfect decision, the world is probabilistic. So I could have several options in front of me, and one of them, assuming payouts are equal, one of them could have like a 40% chance of a bad outcome and another an 80% of a bad outcome and another 20% of the bad outcome. And I know this for sure. So I obviously choose the option that has the 20% chance of a bad outcome, but that means 20% of the time I'm going to observe a bad outcome, just definitionally speaking. So even though I objectively chose the best outcome, I don't have a time machine. Like I can't look ahead and see how luck is going to kind of affect the way that things turn out. So what that means is that after you make a decision to start something, it could be anything, right? Like a job, a project, a business, a sales strategy, a relationship, anything. After that, you will learn new stuff. And that information is going to be two categories of things. One is like facts or like ways to model problems or different ways to think about things that might have changed the way that you were thinking about it at the time if you had had a different fact. And then the other is just like, how is the world turning out? Right? Like, am I heading down the good stuff or am I heading down bad stuff? So given that we're going to learn new stuff afterwards, when that new stuff that we learn is adverse, it's giving us a bad signal saying, hey, like you thought this thing and you thought you were going to end up on this path that was actually going to help you to advance toward your goals. But now I'm the world and I'm telling you that you're not actually on that path. Then what you ought to do is switch, right? You ought to say, okay, I didn't know very much when I started, didn't have a time machine, wasn't omniscient, but now I'm kind of living in the future that I wish I could have seen. And I can see things aren't so great. And so if I wouldn't have chosen this option in the first place, given what I know now, I ought not to continue with this option and I ought to switch. That's why it's such an important skill because of the uncertainty at the start, it means that we have to be really good at recognizing them when we've learned new facts that tell us, I really should switch. The problem is that we're terrible at it.
Yeah. I'm reading a book. It was on my shelf for a while. Someone gave it to me and I wasn't really interested and I kept hearing about the psychology of money.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Ray
read it.
Kurzweil.
It's a great book. And the author refers to Daniel Kahneman, repeatedly. And he endorsed your book before he passed away. And I remember one of the most important things he said is if he could wave a magic wand over humankind, it would be to make them less optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I mean, so much of your work seems to relate to along those lines that we go into all our decisions with this crazy optimism that everything's going to work out exactly how we predict.
Yeah, so I think that there's this issue, right, which is to be a great decision maker, it's helpful for you to have the most accurate view of what the possibilities are for the future. So, we're thinking about choosing one thing over another, right? Like, should we marry this person or marry some other person, or should we take this job or not? Or should we start this project or not? Should I invest in this product or this product? Like, whatever it might be. And for any option that we're considering, there's some set of outcomes that are associated with it. Each of those outcomes has some payoff, good or bad, and some probability of occurring. So, like, in the simplest sense of that, like, just to sort of ground that in an easy example, if I flip a coin, it can land heads or tails. And that should happen 50% of the time for each, assuming that the coin is fair. Okay. So that's kind of what life is like, right? Like I choose an option and that option could end up heads or tails at some probability. So, like, in order to improve your decision making, you want to get a more accurate, educated guess. What the different outcomes are that could occur for any option that you're thinking about, and what the probability is that they're going to occur. So this is where optimism is really harmful if it's over-optimism.
Right.
One is that you're more likely to think that like the payoff associated with an outcome is higher than it is, that you could win more than is actually really available to you. And you're going to think that that's going to be more probable than it is, right? So you're going to have a twofold problem, which is I think that good stuff is going to happen more often than it actually will. And I think that the good stuff is going to be way better than is probably true. There's actually been some super interesting work out of Don Moore's lab, who's at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. And, he really talks about how people are like, yeah, but like if you're over optimistic, like if you're optimistic, you'll try harder. And if you try harder, that means you'll actually achieve more. And he points out like, okay, like let's imagine that you have to jump a 7-foot crevasse. And you've only ever jumped 6.5 feet. Would optimism maybe help you there? Like, possibly. It might help you get that extra half foot. But what if you have to jump a 25-foot crevasse and you've only ever jumped 6.5 feet? Now, optimism, you're just going to die. You're going to be like, oh, I can do this. And then you're going to be dead. So he says, like, this whole idea, like, we have this myth around optimism that it's like helpful because it's going to make us try harder and go for more stuff. But like, what happens when the stuff isn't reasonable? So he actually did a really interesting study where he had people trying to find Waldo and also sort of do really hard math problems, sort of those two types of tasks. And what he did was he asked people in advance, if I sort of find out how optimistic somebody is, how well do you think they're going to do on this task? Like, how many math problems do you think they're going to solve? Like, how quickly do you think they're going to find Waldo? And people do have this intuition, right? Like, he actually, when he was actually asking people this, they have this intuition that they're going to do better at it. So he knows that the people that he's actually going to study think that if you're optimistic, you're actually going to do better on the task. So now he's got kind of a measure of how optimistic each person who's about to do this task is. And the question is it actually true? Are the more optimistic people, do they actually do better on these tasks? And what he finds out, this I think is so interesting, is they don't do better. They just spend longer. So in other words, like, let's say, you or Jim, you're doing a math problem and it's really hard and it's, say, beyond, what you think that you can solve. So do you just move on to the next problem because you're like, I actually don't know this formula and I can't actually solve it? Or do you just keep at it, wasting your time on something that you can't actually figure out, that you could be spending on a math problem that you could solve, and then you could actually solve more problems, right? And if you're optimistic, you spend more time doing stuff that you're not actually going to succeed at. So they don't find Waldo more. They don't solve more math problems. They spend more time on the stuff that they're not actually going to be able to solve. So what it does is it causes the stickiness in the face of a lot of information that you shouldn't be sticking. And that's kind of what he sees optimism doing.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. I really like that study. And, some of the things that have stuck with me through all our episodes or some of the psych studies and all the books I've read that like really kind of bring things home. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this topic, quitting in general, is, because you were touching on it there, like effort versus reward. Okay.
Right.
And so I'm always kind of struck by timing, because the effort to swing a baseball bat and hit a home run is the same effort to hit a foul ball. And my guess is the same tennis swing that could hit an ace could also be, a fault. And so, it's a matter of timing. When did I hit the ball? When did I make my decision? And so in that regard, I think timing and quitting is something that you talk about. And one of the things you talk about is like, if we quit, we always feel like it's too early. Okay.
At the time that we're quitting.
At the time we're quitting. And so, but like most of the time, as let's say people who coach others, we talk about like, you kind of waited too long to make that decision. Like you just hung on to that for way too long. How can people get the timing right to get the most out of, this decision framework, which I think is really distinguishes you among like a lot of the people out there talking about this stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So just to clarify, when you're thinking about quitting, it will generally feel like it's too early. But when you're looking at someone from the outside, if you're coaching, it'll feel like they're too late. But here's the interesting thing. If you look back for yourself on the times that you've quit in the past, do you mostly think, oh, I did that way too soon? Or do you think, oh, I did that way too late? And we all think that we did it too late. We all think we waited too long. When we look back in the past, so this is an important concept called distancing. And so if I'm coaching you, if I'm looking at you from the outside, I have psychological distance from you. So that distance allows me to see more clearly your situation than you can see yourself. But interestingly enough, if I'm looking back at some previous version of myself, I also have psychological distance. So I can I can also see more clearly that I waited too long to do that. And there's lots of studies that show that we quit way too late, as judged by our happiness for people who stick to something they're considering to quitting, which is less than the happiness of people who actually quit things that they're considering quitting, even when they're randomly assigned to quitting or not quitting. It's just we're happier if we quit once we're at the point where we're thinking about it. So we're just kind of too slow to quit. So the question is, you're asking, how can we get that right? And my answer is, well, we can't, but we could get it better. When we sort of shift our mindset from, I need to get this right, as if like I need to quit at exactly the right time, to, well, like if I know that generally I'm quitting too late, if I do that a little bit less, then I'm going to be a lot better off. And why am I going to be a lot better off? Because when we don't quit something that we ought to quit, we have a double problem. One problem is that we're doing something that isn't helping us achieve our goals. And the other problem is an opportunity cost problem, that all the effort and time and attention and money that I'm putting into this thing that isn't helping me achieve my goal, I could shift over to something that is. So we kind of have a dual hit. So let's imagine if something was going to take you 6 months to quit and you could do it in 3 months, even though you should have done it 6 months before, but now you're cutting the time in half to get to the quit. Obviously, that's going to really accelerate your progress toward your goal. So we're just trying to get better. And one of the best ways to do that actually is to leverage this idea of psychological distance. And we can do that in 2 ways. One is I can recruit you to help me. So I can talk to a coach and say, hey, here's my situation. Like, can you help me think through this? And that can be incredibly helpful to have someone who I would call a quitting coach, which is just helping you figure out when should you stop things and when shouldn't you. But that can be combined with something that I call kill criteria, which requires some mental time travel. So remember, you have psychological distance from me, but I can also get psychological distance from myself by looking back on a previous version of myself, right? So if I'm looking back at me when I'm 20, I have a lot of psychological distance. So I can see that person pretty objectively compared to how I might see myself today. But I can also do it the other direction. If I'm thinking about myself in the future, I also have psychological distance and I'm more likely to see myself more clearly. So one of the exercises that I do with executives that I coach when they're having trouble, say, letting an employee go, which is a very common issue. We know that people do it late. There's lots and lots of studies. You can look up stuff from Jeff Smart, for example, showing that we just like the amount of money and productivity that's lost to letting people go too late is tremendous. So they'll be like, oh, I don't know, what should I do? Da, da, da. And what I'll say to them is, Jan, how long are you okay with this situation as it is, with this person in seat at the level of performance that they currently have? So the person will usually say, 6 weeks, let's say. Mm-hmm. And then I'll say, okay, great. So imagine it's 6 weeks from now. So notice that I'm getting you some time in the future away from the moment, which is painful, because as soon as you have to let that person go, you've failed. You failed to develop that employee, to get that employee to perform in the way that you'd really like. Maybe you were the one who hired them and it's like a personal failure for you. There's a lot of stuff getting in the way of that. So now I say, okay, it's 6 weeks from now. What would have to be true of the world for you to want to keep this person on? What benchmarks would they have to hit? So now we can write down what those benchmarks are and we can agree, well, if the person doesn't hit the benchmarks, then you ought to let them go. And if they do hit the benchmarks, then great, that's amazing. Then so they do that. So sometimes what happens when they do that is they realize, wait, there's no way. And they can get they can get faster to the letting go. But usually that, it's hard for them to get to that space. So what I'll do then is I'll say, now I want you to go to the employee and I want you to tell them, could you do me a favor and just work on this alone? But imagine it's 6 weeks from now. What are the benchmarks that you think you need to hit in order to think that this relationship is working? And then separately, tell me what inputs you think you need in order to hit those marks. So you have them do that as well. So now you come together, you sort of compare notes, you can come up with a list. I would say close to half the time the employee will resign when you do that, because they sort of realize like they can't get there. But in the case that they don't, you give them the inputs, you check in 6 weeks, and then the person is more likely to let them go. And you might say, well, wait a minute, like they probably should let them go that day if it's at that point, right? And it's like, no, but this gets them to do it in 6 weeks, maybe a little sooner. And otherwise, I'm telling you the number of times where it's like 6 months later. One of the funniest ones was I was talking to someone and they told me, we hadn't done this exercise, but they told me they were going to let somebody go. And then I went on a 3-month sabbatical. Like they were like, I'm letting that person go next week. Yeah. And then I went on a 3-month sabbatical and I came back and I was like, why is this person still here? You said you were going to let them go. And like everything had gotten much worse. And this is what happens, is that we sort of delay it.
Yeah.
So that mental time travel is incredibly helpful. And that lets you allow, sort of set these benchmarks, which are kill criteria, right? Like if you don't meet them, you're gone. And then when you share that with a quitting coach, when you share that with someone who can hold you accountable to those things, it's even better, because I swooped in after my 3-month sabbatical and that person was gone the next week. It's just like, because I had just gone off for 3 months and so I couldn't hold them accountable to it.
Yeah. Annie, there's an article came out on about 6 days ago. The title was, What is the Great Lock-In? Inside Gen Z's End-of-Year Self-Improvement Trend. And here's the sub. The viral trend reframes back-to-school season as a month-long grind to refocus, reset, and commit to personal goals ahead of 2026. And I'm guessing it's, fitness goals and diet goals. And I mean, all these things that are hard to do, where the probability of failure is probably phenomenal. I mean, what advice would you put out to people that are approaching goals? They've got all these goals and I've got to get them done before December. And if I don't, I'm a big failure. I mean, what advice do you have?
There's a few things. One thing is, I think it's important with goals to have unlesses associated with them.
What? I'm sorry.
Add an unless.
Unless.
And unless is like, it'd be like a kill criteria. The reason why I ask people to do that is because what a goal is a representation of some sort of cost benefit analysis that you've done. So you could think about like, I want to run a marathon. So the goal is 26.2 miles. So there's some cost benefit analysis that's associated with that, right? That has to do with what are you trying to gain in terms of your health and feeling like you're doing something really hard that very few people do, and so on and so forth. You can think about whatever is associated with that, but then there's also cost to that, which is like time away from your family. While it can make you more healthy, it can also cause injuries and make your body not healthy. And there's a variety of costs associated with training for a marathon. And so we have some idea of how do we think those things are going to balance out with each other. And then we learn new information. So one of the things is that you don't want the goal itself to become an object, because it is a representation of a cost benefit analysis. And when that, like the costs change and the benefits change, you want to pay attention to that, because it may not any longer be the correct goal. So I think it's important to have an unless. So an example would be in every single marathon that anybody has ever run, somebody breaks something and continues to run after they've broken something. So there's a famous case of a woman named Siobhan O'Keefe who was running the 2021 London Marathon and broke her leg on mile 8, and she kept running. And you're like, well, why'd she do that? That's really weird. Because clearly she can do permanent damage when we think about the costs, right? She could do permanent damage to her body, which would cause her to never be able to run again. Like, we know that. That's clear. And you have this weird thing where you know that if you had said to her in advance, you're going to break your leg on mile 8, do you want to start the race? She clearly would have said no. And if you said, well, what if you break your leg on mile 8, do you think you'll stop? And I think she would have said no. But once she was in it, the problem is that she's now at 8 miles. She's now 18.2 miles short of her goal. And so she doesn't stop running because the goal is the object now. So that's one thing that I want people to understand, is that when you set a goal, it's still a forecast. It's your best guess of the thing you should be heading toward in order to actually achieve some broader objective. So if you say, I'm committing to go to the gym 4 times a week, that's not really the goal. The goal is like, I want a healthier, happy life, but the 4 times a week becomes like the object, and doesn't matter what's happening. If you're injured or whatever, you'll end up going. So you need to sort of set up these, like, what are the circumstances under which I would change that? I think that's really important. The second thing is taking this idea of sort of mental time travel, is that if you're going to do it, it's really good to have pre-commitment devices. So you have to create some sort of pre-commitment to what you want to do. And it's better to do it with a friend, with somebody. So you want to have some sort of accountability coach. That could be somebody that you find. I mean, there are accountability coaches online that you could find, but usually you can just buddy up. And just the fact that you're buddied up and you're sort of in the journey together makes it more likely that you're actually going to follow through on whatever it is that you've committed to.
Yeah. I was a decent runner. I never placed in a race, but I was reading a book called The Lore of Running. I figured out at a certain point, I don't have the genes. And I remember when I got to this part in this very academic book, I totally changed all my objectives. I'm like, to get to even a little bit faster will require all these I'm not willing to do that. And I'm like, I just accepted the fate that
Yeah.
I didn't choose my parents very well with regard to athletic prowess.
Well, but that's the thing. And then you can just change the goal to,
Yeah. Hey, before I throw it over to Jim, just a reminder, our sponsor is a family-owned business based in the Midwest and has been a trusted partner to the U.S. military and first responders for over a century. From mission-critical defense equipment to innovative firefighting solutions, Darley ensures heroes are equipped for success. Learn more about Darley's dedication to excellence at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com.
Yes, and thank you, Jan, my accountability partner on this podcast. I think it's been easier with a partner, and there's a lot of truth to that. One of the reasons why I'm so excited about this podcast today and talking about your new book, which is Quit: The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away, was because I loved your first book.
Oh,
Okay, Thinking in Bets. I mean, absolutely, totally love this book. And it's, thinking in bets, making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts. And so I just think that is one of those books everyone has to read. I just think it's fantastic. And so, what I'm really curious about is, I think that's great framework. Love the Steve Bartman story. Thought you nailed that. But I think the thing is like, okay, when you don't have all the facts, you got to make good decisions. I think you have a decision framework criteria for everything. I like how it's coupled with this, but like, we've got so many things that jam us up. We've got this need to have all the information. We've got, our intellectual, biases and logical fallacies that we get in the way. Help us filter out how to get through the noise and get to the signal. When you combine all this work you've been doing over the many, many years now.
Oh, that's a really broad question. So let me take that in 2 parts, because there were 2 pieces in there. One had to do with like wanting to know all the information and whatnot. And then the other is like, how do you actually sort of get past the biases? So let's just attack the first one, and then we can move on to the second one. So that, you're kind of talking about this. People get really slowed down in their decision making because they feel like they need to know. Right. And we open this chat with me saying, you're not omniscient and you don't have a time machine. That's the problem. Thank God you can quit. Right. Like that. It's really good that you have the option to stop things, because that would be very hard to ever start anything if you didn't have that option. But I think that when we're entering into decisions, we don't think about that option. We don't think of, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll just stop. Right. And we don't plan for it. And so if you think about the decision as last and final, which it's not, then you can really get caught up in this sort of like, I need more information. I need more information. I need more information, even if that information isn't going to change your mind. So I think that you have to have just a really good framework for figuring out like, well, how much information do I really need for this decision? And what it has to do with is what I think about is the sort of time/effort versus accuracy trade-off. So let's talk about time as a proxy for effort. The more time that you put into something, the more that you do analysis, the more that you gather information, the more that you get other people's opinions, with some diminishing returns, you should assume to see gains in accuracy on the choices that you make. Fair. The less that you do of that, you're probably going to end up with less accuracy. In other words, you're going to introduce more error into the decision. So how we actually balance that out, once we sort of understand that, is by thinking about, well, how much do I care about introducing error into the decision? So I'm sure that you or a friend, you've been in a situation where someone's taking a long time ordering off a menu. It's just like, can you come back? Can you go to me last? Asking the wait staff, asking everybody at the table what their opinion is. And the thing is that's sort of what you're talking about, right? Which is like, but what if what I order is not very good? Then I'm going to feel like, well, but I should have gotten the information and I made a mistake and I'm so stupid. But like, how could that really be a mistake? Like, you don't have a time machine. You don't know what that dish is going to be like. You're doing it off a description of the menu. But more importantly, how much does it matter?
Yeah.
Like, you're going to have another meal in 6 hours. So like, one thing I try to say to people who are like really struggling with a menu is like, let's imagine your meal's kind of bad. It's a year from now. Did it affect your happiness up or down that like your steak was overcooked? What about if it's a month from now? Did it matter? And we can take that like off of a menu into like people who are spending all their time trying to decide among 10 perfectly qualified interns. And I try to get them out of that fear of like, but what if I hire someone and they're not good, to, well, what if you do? Does it matter? How much is that going to affect your bottom line, your business's bottom line over the course of the next year if you hire an intern that turns out to be not so great? And the answer is like 0. So why are you spinning your wheels, spending so much time on that decision? If it doesn't really matter, the impact of it is really low in the long run. Now, that's not to say everything is low impact, right? Some things are super high impact, like if you're hiring a CFO, high impact. There's a big difference between going on a date and getting married. Going on a date, low impact. Getting married, high impact. And then we can go to you can stop it. Easier to stop a date than it is to stop a marriage, right? It's easier to stop having an intern than it is to stop having a CFO. So we can sort of combine those two ideas of like sort of what's the long-term impact of something and also how easy is it to unwind. And where we want to really spend our effort is on the long-term high impact, difficult to unwind, and not spend effort on the long-term low impact, easy to unwind. And once you kind of have that mental model, it frees you up from needing to know to saying, well, it doesn't really matter. So like these 10 look fine. I'll put their names in a hat and I'll pick one out. Like flip a coin. Tell the waiter to surprise you. Right? Because none of them actually really matter. Those things don't really matter that much. And that allows you to sort of apportion your decision-making time a little bit better.
Yeah. Annie, you're making me think that, again, this whole idea of grit, and I think, I get asked this question a lot about, one of the things I did early in my life, how hard it was and grit, and aren't you glad you didn't quit? But as I've gotten older, I kind of go back to, decisions, and I want to get your perspective on this is, decisions to me are a lot easier if we absolutely know what we value and in priority order.
Mhm.
You talk about kill criteria and those types of things, but if we know, hey, here's what's really important to me in my life, and here's how these values rank, and here's what's worth fighting for, and here's, things that aren't. How much of it is it really goes back to sort of the Socratic thing of knowing thyself?
Okay, so first of all, a lot, although we don't know ourselves, that oftentimes our preferences are revealed to us. So like what we say our preferences are is not what our preferences are.
Hmm.
And part of that is because we have competing preferences.
Right.
So we have
But competing values too.
right. So what I value for my short-term self might be different than what I value for my long-term self. Example,
Hmm.
I value longevity and health, and I would like 70-year-old me to be super healthy. But me today is like, cookie. So we value different things, right? Because we have different versions of ourselves. We know this is a big problem with retirement, right? Like people are like, yes, I would like future me to have enough money to enjoy a happy and healthy retirement. That Lamborghini looks really nice though. So this is a consistent battle, right? So we do have these competing preferences, these competing values. And then when you get into a team situation, obviously now you have a different type of competition because different people on the team may have different preferences and different values. So we always have to think about that. Number two is we often don't make those things explicit. So we kind of assume we sort of know how we're modeling the world. We know what our preferences, we know what our values are. We think we know how those fit in, but we haven't actually made it explicit. And we don't make it explicit. What happens is that that's where bias can go wild because how much we're emphasizing or thinking about or uh how much we're sort of putting in the front some part of a narrative that's going to get us to the decision that we want to make, right, is going to be more the less explicit that we've made sort of how we're modeling the decision. So as an example, so I'll just give you an example from like investing. Let's imagine you're an early stage venture capitalist. So you're investing in companies at the earliest stage, and you talk to a founder. Very often you're going to have a feeling. And that feeling is going to be one of either I want to invest in that person or I don't. And the question is, how much are the feelings leading as opposed to your model? And you sort of think, well, no, I'm applying the same model and I'm thinking about each thing the same way, except that maybe for you really want to invest in this person. And even though the market's kind of bad and the product's not great, you really clicked with them. And so you're just really highlighting founder quality as opposed to the other stuff that might be a piece of the puzzle, right? And so we tend to highlight and lowlight things that sort of fit the conclusion that we're trying to get to. And that conclusion very often is not going to fit with long-term what is best for us. It's going to be satisfying a short-term need to sort of get to the conclusion that feels good for us in the moment. So what we'd prefer to do is make all of these things explicit. So with early stage investors that I've worked with, what we've done is among all the partners, because remember, they all have sort of different models of these things and different preferences and different values. We ask them like, okay, when you're thinking about an investment, what are the things that you're thinking about? And then we get that across, say, everybody in the partnership, and then we can create a decision rubric around that, sort of integrating across the answers, which is broadly say you have to give a rating, say 1 to 7, of the quality of the market, the quality of the team, the quality of the founder, the quality of the product. And for any of those, we also have judgments that you make that have that basically define the category for you. What are the pieces of how we would define this that would tell us whether, say, a market is good or a product is good. So with market, it might be, total addressable market is expanding. How much do you agree with that statement on a scale of 1 to 7? Competitive landscape, things like that. So now when you look at this rubric, which has, 60 or 70 judgments on it, you can make those judgments pretty quickly. A few things happen. One is all the stuff that you're talking about is completely explicit. Here's what we value, right? In an investment, this is what aligns with our values. We have made this explicit. Here's how we model good and bad, right? So that's happened. Number two is you can't hide from it. So if you're making a decision, you have to fill out ratings for every single piece of this, even for the things that don't really fit what your intuition is telling you, right? So that's number 2. Number 3 is because it's explicit and you're having to make these judgments, now I can look back at them. Because a lot of times what happens is that we sort of fit the past to fit what happened. So if an investment goes bad, we'll misremember it as, well, we didn't like it anyway. An investment goes great, we'll misremember it as like, oh, I loved that one. That I thought it was great. Now we have all this data around every single one of the decisions. And so we can actually close the feedback loop and start to show you how you become more accurate. What judgments are you good at? What judgments are you not good at? How can we get you to be better? What is the partnership as a whole good at? What are individuals sort of differently able to judge, and that kind of thing. And it becomes this huge trove of data that now allows us to map the decision point onto how things unfold in the future. And we can do that because we've made everything explicit. And because they know, look, we're going to look at this in the future, it relieves some of that competition around, I want the cookie, but I want to be healthy. Because if I know that whatever judgments I'm making today are going to be checked in on in the future, I'm more likely to now pay more attention to what my long-term goals are, as opposed to my short-term wants and desires. And it helps with that sort of competition between those values and preferences that I might have today, one of which might be, well, I like the person and I really want to be right? Versus what the values and preferences of long-term me might be, which is on average, I want to make great choices about what I invest in so I can make lots of money in the future. And those are really different values, but I can get one to be more heavily weighted by making these things explicit. I hope that made sense.
Yep.
Yeah, I like the discussion of like the explicit discussion. I think that's so important with partnerships and anytime you're doing stuff like this. And, the parallel I see between, let's say, our discussion on quitting is a lot with like our discussions that we've had with all the experts that come on, talk about negotiation. And you never really want to take walking away from the table off the table.
No, that's the first thing I say to everybody who calls me for negotiation coaching is, every deal can be broken. And even if you break it, it's not broken.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting about this, because this is getting me thinking about, a lot of discussions I've had with people through the years. But when we talk about the explicit discussions about, let's say, the outcomes or the end states or what we're trying to seek or what the future looks like or what we want it to look like,
right?
Even the parameters for like, when we might walk away. I'm really curious if it's also important. I think I know your answer, but if it's also important to really discuss the opportunity costs, not only when you're making a decision for yourself, but be very explicit among people on a team talking about what are the opportunity costs for the organization, but for me personally, and even if it's a personal discussion about a personal goal I'm trying to achieve, like what are my opportunity costs here?
So like 1,000 times, yes. One of the biggest problems in decision making is what's called opportunity cost neglect. So again, this is a little bit that competition between me now and me in the future, right? Because me now, when I'm sticking to something, I'm very focused on the thing I'm doing and whether I'm actually going to be able to achieve whatever it is I want to do. So we can think about it as like summit fever, right? Like we're right there and the summit's right there. And so all we can see is that is, I want to achieve that thing. And we're not thinking about, well, what are the other things that this is costing me, right? And that could be just simply, if I continue toward the summit, the probability of death is way too high. And if I die, obviously I can't do anything else in my life because I'm dead. Or if I'm like seriously injured or whatever those things are. But like in the simplest sense of the word, like sort of the simplest way to think about it is like, let's imagine that I'm monogamous. If I'm in a relationship, I can't be in any other relationship, right? So there are other opportunities that I cannot pursue because I'm in a monogamous relationship. That is what I've chosen to be in. If I'm on a particular route, like I've taken a particular path to work, I can't simultaneously be on another path. And then we can take that further and say, okay, so what that means is that less switching costs. Whatever path I'm on ought to be helping me to achieve my broader goals, say it's health or something like that, over some other path that I could possibly choose, right? So for you, Jan, like if running is like, I want to be healthy and I want to do something that's making me happy and so on and so forth, but you get really caught up in the running itself as if you quit, that would be a failure. That might stop you from doing other things that might help you achieve the same amount or more happiness and more health, right? And we want to always be sort of aware, well, what would I be doing if I weren't doing this thing? It's sort of the way to sort of get to that question. Well, let's imagine I weren't doing this. What would I do? So what I try to get teams to do is to say, to actually do that thought experiment. So there's a bunch of different interesting thought experiments that you can have them do. One is called a postmortem. Let's imagine that you have some go-to-market or a sales strategy, or you've launched you're developing a product, or you've got a project going. You say, imagine it's 6 months from now and this has gone terribly wrong, right? Why do you think that that's happened? And that helps you to get to these kind of like, well, what's happening in the world? And you could sort of develop these kill criteria, that kind of thing. But then you can also take it further and say, well, imagine that you weren't doing this. It just didn't exist, right? You're not, Jan, you're not allowed to run anymore. I just want you to imagine that. What would you be doing instead? Like, so you spend a certain amount of time, I don't know what it is, a certain amount of time running every week. Let's imagine that I tell you that that's not allowed anymore. What would you do with that time? What are the things that you would use that time for? And that can actually really help you to get to see the opportunity costs. Now you can combine that with kill criteria and say, okay, if that's what I would be doing with my time, and I sort of imagine that, then what are the things that I could see happen in the future that would tell me that I ought to switch to those other things?
Yeah.
The thing I'm doing isn't actually helping to me to achieve the thing that I'm doing. And I think those types of exercises should be done on a relatively rapid cadence, because the facts on the ground are changing so quickly. We're learning new information so much, and we don't want the summit to become the goal.
Yeah. So much of what you've shared is a reminder that none of us are as self-aware as we think we are.
No.
And two, we are not good predictors of the future. And decisions always require you basically look in the crystal ball and say, I'm going to decide this because I think this is going to produce a good outcome. It's going to make my life better. And, again, we're a different person yesterday than we are today. We're a different person today than we will be tomorrow. So that's sort of those
Right, and that's not to say that it's not really useful to make these predictions about the future. Of course it is. Right? You have to make, in order to select an option, you have to have an educated guess about what you think the future might hold. The good news, and this goes back to what Jim was saying, is that the more that you're thinking about, well, what are the things that I could see in the future that would cause me to switch, right? That would cause me to want to stop what I'm doing and maybe switch to something different. And the more that you're building that into the initial decision, the less that you're afraid that you don't know very much when you make those guesses, the less that you sit there in this sort of paralysis by analysis, thinking that, like, if I could just ask one more question or get one more reference or find out one more piece of information, that somehow I would know for 100% certain. And it allows you to actually be much more agile.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways to intuit that allows you to be much more agile is to think about this in relation to innovation. If I'm innovating, that means nobody's done it before. That's the whole concept.
Yeah.
And if nobody's done it before, that means I'm going to have the least amount of information when I start. It means that there's going to be the biggest influence of luck on what the outcome looks like. So when we innovate, that's when we're sort of maximally going to learn new information after we start. Yeah. And most of the time, that information is going to be bad because we're just taking a swing. Right? Like, now it's an educated swing, but an educated swing with very little education in it because we're innovating.
Yeah.
So in order to be a really good innovator, you have to build in this whole idea of quit. Because otherwise you find out new information, you don't pivot fast enough, and you kind of get stuck in something that isn't actually going to get you there, right? Because it's not something that's really well studied, right? It's not something that we know anything about for sure. And then I think we can take from that, if we understand that about innovation, that hiring someone looks more like inventing a new product than you think it does. You think you know a lot about hiring, but like, do you know that? How well do you know the person? How well do you know they're going to fit in the job? Have they ever been in your company? Do you know if they're going to be a cultural fit? I mean, you have like 3 conversations with them and then like a couple references, and maybe you backdoor one. Like, you know nothing.
Right.
So it's just like, it is innovation, right? So you have to build these things in on the back end.
Yeah. It's so great. I mean, Annie, this has been great having you on our show today. You're making me think of going west on I-70. There's times when you want to go skiing and you just go, I'm going to take the off ramp and go home. It's not
Yeah.
worth 3 hours of traffic. But anyway, I'm really glad we didn't get into poker because I know nothing about cards. So I'm glad we didn't get into that. But really, it's been really great having you on the show, and I'm sure our listeners are going to have a lot of good thoughts and comments.
Well, thank you so much. This has been very fun. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. And Jan, I would have loved to have talked the whole time about poker, but that's not what we're about. We're about leadership.
Yeah.
For our listeners, that's all we have for you this week. We'll include ways for you to connect with Annie. So follow us and on YouTube and subscribe, and you can find out everything you want at theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Then quit. There's no point in being a damn fool about it. W.C. Fields.
There you go.
It's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.